Hello, I'm Montse Alvarado, and this is EWTN News In Depth.
Religious freedom is not a junior varsity right. It's foundational.
As the Supreme Court completes its term, a look at important decisions that impact both religion and religious freedom. Plus, analysis from former U.S. Solicitor General Paul Clement. The pressure to reform our voting system. Our expert panel takes a deep dive into possible changes with a look at election integrity and access.
I can see in the sky things that are beautiful and familiar and have a history and smile at me and remind me that God makes good things.
The astronomer to the Pope takes us behind the scenes at the Vatican Observatory to explain how science reveals God's loving plan.
One nation under God.
It wasn't always so. As we celebrate the 4th of July, a little history lesson on how under God was incorporated into the Pledge of Allegiance. EWTN News In Depth is next.
I think this is a big victory for religious foster care and adoption agencies and for people of faith, because the Supreme Court came together unanimously to say there are solutions here that are win-win solutions.
Lead counsel reacts to one of the biggest religious liberty cases decided during this closely watched Supreme Court term. In today's program, we analyze what happened this term in the Roberts Court, if we can see any trends, and how the justices' rulings will impact the faithful. Welcome to EWTN News In Depth. I'm Montse Alvarado. Thank you for joining us. As the Supreme Court term comes to a close, what did we learn about how this court will approach matters of religious freedom? And what did we learn about its newest member, Justice Amy Coney Barrett? Political affairs correspondent Kate Scanlon reports.
Religious freedom is not a left versus right, Republican versus Democratic issue.
A Supreme Court term that began in controversy over its membership ends in unity on religious freedom. Over the last several years, a series of contentious Supreme Court confirmations resulted in Justices Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. As a result, many expected the court to issue partisan rulings on simple majorities this term, but the court largely defied that expectation. Notre Dame law professor Rick Garnett explains.
And the reality is that the Supreme Court is very often unanimous, and is unanimous or 8-1 a majority of the time.
One of those unanimous cases was Fulton versus Philadelphia. The High Court sided with foster mothers, including Sharon L. Fulton, and Catholic Social Services in their lawsuit against Philadelphia. The city ended its contracts with the agency when it would not certify same-sex couples as foster parents on religious grounds.
And I think the fact that the Supreme Court decided it unanimously really illustrates that the justices understood what was at stake here.
Lori Wyndham, senior counsel at Beckett, who represented the plaintiffs, says the ruling is a big victory for people of faith.
It is not necessary to go around shutting down those who have traditional beliefs about marriage in order to ensure that there are homes for children and homes for families.
But Fulton versus Philadelphia was just one of the First Amendment cases the court heard this term. They also considered COVID restrictions on houses of worship.
What the court was saying is that our constitutional rights don't take a sabbatical during times of emergency.
Uzma Uden is a religious liberty lawyer and scholar. She joined an interfaith effort to support an Orthodox Jewish community's challenge to New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's restrictions on religious services that were blocked by the Supreme Court.
The principle is what we need to stand in support of, so that no matter what the specifics of the case at hand, it's the bigger principle of protecting everyone's rights.
In other notable cases this term, the court upheld the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, and came down in favor of a Pennsylvania cheerleader in a landmark free speech case. The court also chose not to weigh in on a case concerning gender identity and bathrooms in schools. The term also marked the first for Barrett, who was confirmed last fall just days before the presidential election. Garnett, a friend and former colleague of Barrett's, said she had a strong performance in her first term on the court.
She's just been very judicious and thorough and clear in her writing. And my sense is that people whose business is reading Supreme Court opinions have really welcomed that.
Kate Scanlon, EWTN News In Depth.
Another major Supreme Court decision at the end of the term this week. In a 6-3 vote, the court's 6 conservatives upheld voting restriction regulations in Arizona. The measures limit who can return early ballots for another person and deny counting ballots that are cast in the wrong precinct. The federal appeals court in San Francisco said the measures disproportionately affect minorities. An opinion by Justice Alito, writing for the court's majority, stated the restrictions are not racially discriminatory. For more analysis on what we saw this term, we turn to one of America's leading legal minds, a man who has argued more cases before the U.S. Supreme Court since the year 2000 than any other lawyer. Joining us for this on-the-record interview is former U.S. Solicitor General Paul Clement. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today. What are your general reflections about the term?
So it's great to be with you. I think this was a term where the court was a little bit in transition. They obviously had a new member join the court even after the first arguments of the term began. And Justice Barrett replacing Justice Ginsburg was obviously a major change for the court. Justice Ginsburg had been on the court for decades. Justice Barrett joins the court from the Seventh Circuit. And I think in many respects, the court had a slower term than in some past years. And I think that's all a reflection of the fact that the court is in transition this year. It's finding its new kind of rhythms with its newest justice. And of course, it had to do all of that while proceeding remotely over the telephone and rather than in person, and in a slightly different argument format than it typically uses. So I think for all these reasons, this was a term where the court was able to find unanimity in some cases where it probably wasn't expected. They ended up dismissing a couple of the high-profile cases because of the change in administration. And so for all these reasons, I think it was an important term. They decided some important cases, particularly about religious liberty, and I think we'll talk about at least one or two of those soon enough. But I think it was maybe a term where the court was catching their breath. And they certainly have some big issues on deck for next term.
It certainly feels like the whole country was catching its breath. After Thursday's voting rights ruling, let's get into that piece of it, upholding Arizona's 2 voting rights provisions. How do you think the DOJ's challenge to similar efforts in Georgia will proceed? How will they fare?
Well, I think this decision does make the DOJ's challenge tougher. I think, I don't think the DOJ will withdraw anything, but I do think the court's analysis makes it tougher. I think the court basically kind of clarified the law that in order to show a discriminatory impact based on a change in a voting practice or a voting policy, it's not enough to just show discriminatory impact, and they elaborated on a multi-factor test. So anytime you're talking about multi-factor tests and the like, I don't think it's a crystal clear ruling that will stop DOJ from pursuing, but I do think it made DOJ's task in challenging the Georgia law that much tougher, because obviously here the Arizona law survived.
That's right. Let's talk about coronavirus cases at the Supreme Court and those circumstances in general. You alluded to this new way of arguing. Tell us a little bit about telephonic arguments.
So telephonic arguments this term, and at the very end of last term, the Little Sisters case, for example, last term was argued over the phone. This is the way the court proceeded during the pandemic. And the biggest kind of difference from the normal way of proceeding, other than the court didn't meet in person, and as an advocate, you weren't able to sort of see the justice's facial clues. The biggest difference is the court proceeded in order of seniority and questioning. And that meant that Justice Thomas was a very active participant in the oral arguments, which is not typically the case in the traditional format. So that's something that really made this term special. I mean, I've been privileged, as you alluded to argue a number of cases in front of the Supreme Court, but I'd argued, dozens and dozens of cases without getting a question from Justice Thomas. And over this last term, I argued 4 cases telephonically and got lots of questions from Justice Thomas in every one of those cases. So that's really been something that I think has been interesting and special about the COVID era cases. And it'll be really interesting to see what happens when the court returns, presumably to normal in the fall, because Justice Thomas's voice has been such an important part of their deliberations this last year. And it seems just kind of hard to believe that that will sort of change completely and go back to kind of pre-COVID normal.
Well, we'll definitely be watching for that. So then let's talk about the COVID cases themselves. What did that tell us about the court and the way it wants to treat religious freedom?
So I think those cases were the most important cases on the court's docket this term that were part of what some people like to call the shadow docket. That sounds kind of sinister. All that means in practice is those cases were decided typically in an emergency posture and without the benefit of oral argument. But I still think those cases were tremendously important, and they really show the difference that Justice Barrett adding to the court made, because there were a couple of early cases where the court declined to intervene, even though it was very clear that on the face of some of the COVID restrictions in certain states, they were treating religious worship less favorably than commercial activity, even casinos. And the court still refused to get involved. And then with the change in personnel, you all of a sudden saw a real change, and the court demanding that religious worship be treated no differently and certainly no worse than other kinds of activity. And I think that's really probably the most important thing that emerges from those cases. And the Fulton case involving Catholic Social Services in Philadelphia is those cases really say that the government has to treat religion at least as favorably as all other kinds of activity, or the government's going to face what we lawyers like to call strict scrutiny, and that typically means the government loses.
That's right. So then what about free speech? There were at least 3 big cases: the young man on the university campus, Chieko Uzwegbunum, the cheerleader who wrote cheer-related profanity on her Snapchat. What do those cases tell us about how the court is going to treat free speech going forward?
Sure. So the case about free speech on campus was important, but it's a little bit of a technical case about sort of when a case is over and when you can get relief. And although it seems technical for the court to say you can still get relief by asking for nominal damages, it's more important than you might think, because a lot of these cases, free speech cases, take a while to work their way through the system. It's very typical in one of these cases involving a college student that by the time his or her case gets all the way to the Supreme Court, they've graduated, and then the government or the university says, oh, the case is moot. And so by saying that that's not the case, and the court can vindicate the First Amendment rights, even kind of after a student is graduated and the like, I think that's really important and will be helpful in a lot of these cases in the future. I think the cheerleader case is the one that grabbed a lot of headlines and a lot of attention. I think just because it's a situation everybody can relate to. You have, a young person who's disappointed about not making a team. They, send some Snapchats or the like off campus. And the question is, can they be disciplined for what they said off campus? And the court didn't give a definitive ruling. It didn't say that everything off campus is off limits for the school. But it did, I think, really raise the bar for the schools and did more to protect the free speech rights of students. And although, this case involved, kind of unique facts and a cheerleader, I do think it's going to do more to protect the rights of students with different views in the public schools. And so I do think it on balance is a big case for those that favor free speech rights.
So then, Paul, what can we expect from the court next term? Any comments on big cases they'll address?
Well, as I said, I think you could think of this term as being a little bit the calm before the storm. The court has important cases next term involving Second Amendment rights and abortion. And so those are the cases already on the docket that will grab everybody's attention. The court's going to add a few more cases later today, I think, or in just the next few days. And then we'll be adding cases throughout the fall to its docket. So I think next year will be a very big year. But I would say, one of the lessons of this term, if you look at the Affordable Care Act case, or even a little bit some of the reasoning of the Fulton decision, sometimes the court can duck the big issues, even in the big cases, and save them for another day.
Well, we hope that you'll come back and talk to us about that, because I know that we follow this closely and our viewers want to see what the court is going to do.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I'd be happy to come back.
Thanks so much, Paul. We continue our coverage on voting rights and accuracy. Our expert panel discusses federal and state legislative proposals that could impact future elections after the break.
And it was a moment that showed just how dedicated the church is to being in tune with the science and the technology of the times.
And later, mixing science and faith. The astronomer to 3 popes says understanding the universe is a call to understanding God. EWTN News in Depth will be right back. Welcome back to EWTN News in Depth. I'm Montse Alvarado. Voting regulation continues to make headlines. A massive voting package, H.R. 1, is currently stuck in the U.S. Senate. Democrats say it expands rights by auto registration of voters, mail-in voting, and allowing for 15 days of early voting. Republicans say the legislation could allow for fraud because there's no buffer period to verify personal information with same-day registration, and it undermines states' voter ID laws. Joining us now to weigh in on voter reform, integrity, and access is Jason Snead, the Executive Director of the Honest Elections Project, and Alfonso Aguilar, President of the Latino Partnerships for Conservative Principles. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. There's great pressure to reform our voting system. A voting reform package called H.R. 1 is stalled in the Senate. Jason, do we expect that it will be rewritten or come back in a different form?
I think right now we're expecting that it's going to come back in a different form. H.R. 1 was a massive 800-page bill that would have taken power away from the states to regulate elections and instead given it to Washington, and at the same time weakened basic voting safeguards. Now that it has failed in the Senate, which was not at all surprising to anyone, I think that there are going to be parts of it that will be broken off, and there will be parts of it that will be added to the backup plan, H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is already being presented as a moderate compromise, but is, as I said, really just Plan B. And it does a lot of the same things in terms of giving Washington the ability to block common sense voting safeguards that guarantee both security and access to the vote.
So then let's get into those safeguards. What were these problematic provisions aside from this issue of taking power from the states and giving it to the federal government?
Well, H.R. 1 had a lot of provisions. In fact, it's easier to say the things that I like than the things that I don't, because I didn't really like much of anything in the bill. But it would have eliminated voter identification requirements. It would have made it harder for states to clean up voter rolls. It would have mandated vote trafficking in all 50 states. This is a practice where partisan operatives who are paid to help win elections can go door to door and take voters' ballots off their hands without any sort of supervision. It's a process so prone to abuse that even Jimmy Carter led a bipartisan commission that recommended it be abolished. This bill would have made it legal in all 50 states, and it goes on like that. Basically, if there is a basic election best practice or a safeguard, this bill ran in the opposite direction.
Alfonso, talking about voter ID, how does this affect minority communities, Hispanic and Black communities that are known to have issues of access to voting?
But, interestingly, the majority of polls show that the majority of African Americans and Hispanics support voter ID. It's very popular. I think that's one of the main arguments of the Democrats for H.R. 1, that somehow requiring voter ID or voters to show a state-issued ID to show that they are who they say they are, will somehow suppress the vote of minorities. It's just really not a real argument. There's just no real evidence that requiring voter ID would lead to voter suppression.
And what about discouraging people from showing up at the polls? Is this discussion or even the idea of these reform bills something that discourages minority communities to vote?
Again, there's just no evidence of that. I mean, we just had an election where we had over 155 million people participate. The Hispanic vote went up. So it's just hard to say that imposing these additional requirements will somehow discourage people from voting. The reality is that the measures that are being proposed at the state level only guarantee the integrity of the process. They're not denying anyone the right to vote.
So then let's get into the idea of the last election. Former Attorney General Bill Barr just went on the record in an article in The Atlantic referring to the 2020 presidential election. He said there was no evidence or proof of fraud that would affect the outcome of the election. So is all of this reform legislation going on at the federal and state level actually necessary, Jason?
Oh, I think that a lot of it is, particularly at the state level. We have to remember that there is fraud in every election. The question is to what degree. And we've taken a look at a lot of the claims that there was fraud that could have affected the outcome of the presidential election, and we agree we haven't seen evidence of it yet. But there are many, many reasons for us to be taking seriously the need to guarantee the basic integrity of the process before you get to a point at which a presidential election could be stolen by fraud, because there are two main issues here. One is making it possible to have a smoothly run election, and the other is to make sure that you can convince voters that fraud did not occur, or if it did, that you can easily track it down. The basic credibility of the voting process is what motivates people to stay invested in democracy and keep coming back to vote. It's not just about access, it's also about security, and a lot of the state legislation that you're seeing is balancing those two and trying to find the right way forward that guarantees voters can have confidence in the outcome of our elections.
So then that's the difference between federal level and state level. Then let's talk about Georgia. What's going on in Georgia now that the Department of Justice has decided to weigh in there?
Well, the Justice Department has filed a lawsuit which reads quite a lot more like a press release than a legal complaint. I think this is pretty clearly politically motivated. It's designed to take attention away from the fact that H.R. 1 failed in the Senate and to build pressure once again for the passage of the backup plan that I mentioned earlier, H.R. 4. But the notion that Georgia is intentionally discriminating against voters by asking for a voter ID for absentee ballots or by creating a legal path for drop boxes is, I think, a pretty ridiculous claim. And if I was a betting person, I would not put money on this complaint going very far. I think it's actually more likely being used to try to block the implementation of this voter law that was just passed for the midterms, and to, again, create political pressure to try to drive a push for a Washington takeover of elections.
Alfonso, what are your thoughts on what's going on in Georgia?
Well, I agree. Unfortunately, this is being used for political reasons to somehow try to say that Republicans are trying to prevent people of color to vote, to advance this racism narrative, and it's really, I think, pathetic. I think that the federal government should not get involved in the election process. That is something that is reserved for the states. Yes, we want people to vote, but at the same time, as it has been said, we want to make sure that we can ensure the integrity of the process and that people have confidence in the elections. You know, after the elections of last year, we have millions of people who are confident in the results. So I think it makes sense to strengthen our process to ensure that people can believe in the results, ensure that we have integrity in the system.
Jason, last question for you. What about the recent admission by the Elections Board in the New York mayor's race that produced over 100,000 voting records? What was the issue here? 100,000 voting records that were not legitimate.
Yeah, so these were test ballots that were loaded into the system, and then someone apparently forgot to remove them. New York City is going through a process right now where they're trying something called ranked choice voting, which is a complicated new way to conduct an election. And I think that there are a couple of important lessons. One is this just goes to show that even good-intentioned reforms can lead to bad outcomes that can ultimately lead voters to doubt the credibility of the process. So we always have to keep that in mind. And the second thing is, of course, there are many, many ways that we can improve the electoral process with basic reforms. reforms. So oftentimes what you'll hear is folks, particularly on the left, will attack common sense voting reforms like what we saw in Georgia or what we're about to see in Texas as all being driven by, quote unquote, the big lie and the accusations that President Trump made after the 2020 election. But what we know is that we have a long way to go to deliver good election systems that have the integrity voters deserve. And what's going on in New York is just proof of how much work we actually do have to do to guarantee the basic functionality and efficiency of the election system across the country.
And that these efforts have been ongoing at the state level since 2011 at least, so this is nothing new for us. Thank you both for joining us today, and I hope to have you back to keep continuing this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As Catholics, we're called to show our faith through our vote. For articles and guides related to voting, go to EWTN.com, type voting in the search bar for a list of resources to learn more.
This call to try to understand the universe is a divine call. That is the basis on which we have the courage to be scientists.
Next, we'll tell you about a department of the Vatican most people don't know exists. We'll take you to the Vatican Observatory. Plus, our expert panel weighs in with a robust discussion about the intersection of faith and science. There's a lot in the news right now about space travel as billionaire businessmen Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson race against each other to launch space tourism. But long before these current headlines, the Vatican has been at the forefront of space exploration. Much of that research has been done at the Vatican Observatory, little known outside of scientific circles. The man who has led it for years is an American, known as the Pope's astronomer. He recently spoke to EWTN News In Depth correspondent Clement Flynn.
Station, this is EWTN here in the Vatican. How can you hear me?
That dot of light is not just a pretty star.
Jules, EWTN in the Vatican. This is space station. We hear you loud and clear.
I can see in the sky things that are beautiful and familiar and have a history and smile at me and remind me that God makes good things.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This call to try to understand the universe is a divine call. That is the basis on which we have the courage to be scientists.
Surrounded by the majestic papal gardens on the site of the Pope's former summer residence at Castel Gandolfo is a department of the Vatican that most people don't even know exists. For here, in this heavenly setting, the Vatican Observatory examines the heavens. Brother Guy Consolmagno is a former lecturer at Harvard and MIT. Now a Jesuit, he is the director of the Vatican Observatory.
We've got 12 astronomers, most of them Jesuits. There are a couple of diocesan priests who work with us. And we all have doctorates from different universities from around the world. We come from 4 continents. We do science ranging from, the Planck time of the first 10 to the minus 43 seconds before that time, after the Big Bang, to dust that hits the top of the Earth's atmosphere now and everything in between.
And it's not just here in Castel Gandolfo. Across the Atlantic Ocean in Arizona in the United States, the Vatican purchased this state-of-the-art telescope where priests and brothers with degrees in the sciences, maths and engineering capture awe-inspiring images like these. Why does the Vatican have an astronomical observatory?
Don't you think every major religion should support astronomy? The answer is deeper than that, of course. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII deliberately established a Vatican observatory. Astronomy was a field that the Vatican already had a really strong international reputation. And this was to show the world that the Church was not against science, and also to show the world that the Vatican was a nation with a national observatory.
So it was part scientific and part political.
As most of these things are. The thing that, the reason we continue to have a Vatican observatory is to continue to remind the peoples in the pew that we are not anti-science, that the Church not only supports science, but the Church is mother of science in many ways, because science began in the universities.
And in the observatory's headquarters, they even have a museum documenting the Vatican's contribution to science and astronomy dating back as far as 1582 and the Gregorian reform of the calendar.
This is the first telescope that the observatory got in 1891, and it was installed in a little dome on the Tower of the Winds. So this was back in Vatican City, and in fact, the first telescopes were on the walls of the Vatican City. We didn't move out here until the 1930s.
They also have one of the major collections of meteorites in the world, with over 1,100 pieces from the depths of space.
I get to have my hands on pieces of outer space, and that never stops being a thrill. So we're in the dome of the Schmidt telescope, which is actually just a giant photographic camera. And it was the final telescope installed here at the Vatican. It was put in here in the late 50s. And Pope Pius XII personally bought this telescope out of his family funds, not Vatican funds.
Another incredible piece of history about this room, it is where Pope Paul VI spoke to the astronauts.
The Apollo astronauts on the moon.
Wow.
He was standing, actually sitting, exactly right where you are. First, a blessing in Latin, and then a message to the astronauts in English, referring to the moon as the pale goddess of our dreams.
Wow.
It was beautiful, it was poetic.
Pope Paul VI is speaking to you, astronauts. Greetings and blessing to you, conquerors of the moon.
It was a beautiful, beautiful moment.
Brother Guy is from Detroit in Michigan and entered school in 1959, the year the Russians launched the first satellite, Sputnik. You're unique. You're probably one of the only people in the world who is wearing a Roman collar and an MIT ring. So let's go back. You grew up in Michigan, in the United States of America. Were you always interested in science? I know you call yourself a Sputnik kid.
I started kindergarten the year that Sputnik went up.
1957.
1957. I was, going to grade school when someone would bring in a portable television, which was, bigger than I am now, so we could watch the launches of the Mercury and the Gemini capsules. How could you not be fascinated with science? I grew up in a time when anything was possible.
Very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder.
But I was also fascinated with my religion. Not just a part of my religion, but fascinated by it, in the nerdly sense of the nuts and bolts, how does this work? Because the deep thing is, you're not going to prove God with science. God is bigger than science. God can't be proved by science. God proves that science works, not the other way around.
And for Brother Guy, his love for astronomy has a deeper, more personal meaning.
My father lived to be 100, my mom to 97.
Wow.
Both of them were tremendous role models to me. I was very close to my father in so many ways. He wanted to be an astronomer, but in the Depression, that wasn't going to happen.
Would he look at the stars at night with you?
My father knew the stars. He had learned them as a kid, and then he was a navigator with the Army Air Corps during World War II. So the stars were both a source of pleasure, but also a very important part of very deadly business.
Do you think about him now when you peer through the telescopes?
All the time. All the time I think of him. And there's not a week goes by when there isn't something that I want to tell him about. Something that I know he'd be really, delighted to hear about.
What did he think of the work you were doing?
I hope he was proud, not that I was at the Vatican or knew the popes or whatever, he enjoyed that, but just that I was able to do the astronomy that he'd always wanted to do.
The Vatican Observatory has just launched a new website with beautiful pictures and a podcast, and they have a yearly mentoring program for future generations of astronomers and scientists all over the world. It's amazing that you've been doing this for almost 5 decades, but you still have such enthusiasm and passion for it. It hasn't faded.
If you ever lose the passion for what you're doing, then you've lost the reason to do it. But in astronomy, it's easy. Just go outside at night and look up.
In Rome, Colm Flynn, EWTN News in Depth.
It can seem contradictory to mix science and faith, but as we just heard, the two are actually very compatible. The church and our faith motivate us to discover the world we live in. To lend their perspective on the relationship between the two subjects, our Father Robert Spitzer, host of Father Spitzer's Universe here on EWTN, and the president of the Magis Center and the Spitzer Center, and Dr. Matthew Bunson, EWTN News executive editor and Washington, D.C. bureau chief. Father Spitzer, let's get started with you. We just watched a great interview with the papal astronomer. What does the church teach about watching the stars?
Well, of course, the church has been watching the stars for a long, long time. And indeed, they were doing it before Galileo came, but they cooperated with Galileo at the what's called the Gregorian University today, at the Roman College back then, and in trying to put together a series of mathematical propositions to observe the stars, track them more carefully. And so the church has been involved in stargazing for a long, long time, and developed many of the techniques that have led to confirmations of all kinds of stellar observations. So it might come as no surprise then that the person who discovered the Big Bang Theory, which is now the most rigorously established cosmological theory ever, was a Catholic priest, Monsignor Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest, and did doctorate at MIT and was a colleague of Einstein's and Hubble's. And yeah, he was a Catholic priest. That's the person who developed mathematically the first evidence of the Big Bang Theory in 1927. So
wow.
Yeah, the church has been at it for a long while.
Yes, 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 the church has been at it for a long while, since the birth of Jesus Christ, when we were watching the stars for that as well. Matthew, let's break down some of what Father Spitzer said. The Galileo affair in particular has been used as a way to kind of position the church against science. Can you tell us a little more about that?
The best way to describe the Galileo affair, and I look forward to hearing what Father Spitzer has to say about this, was best described, I think, by Pope St. John Paul II. He called it an episode of mutual incomprehensibility. And what he meant by that was that there was a kind of misunderstanding. We had theologians who at times were applying something of a literal interpretation to Scripture. But then, and this is often overlooked, we have a brilliant astronomer and scientist in Galileo who was trying to impose his scientific beliefs on theology. So the two were at something of an impasse. And yet, as Father alluded, Galileo was long supported by the Church in his work, especially by the popes, especially the popes of that era who understood the significance of his work. And I would also want to give an important bit of credit to a doctor of the Church, St. Robert Bellarmine, who was an ardent supporter of Galileo.
Father Spitzer, how did we get to that point where people think the church and science are somehow in opposition?
Well, it probably started in about the 18th century, where various kinds of historical facts were used to kind of oppose the church. Galileo was the most convenient one because, as Dr. Bunson just put it, clearly there was a misunderstanding between both parties, and the misunderstanding led to a house exile of Galileo, which was thought to be unfair at the time. However, it was actually a very sort of lenient way of sort of, expressing disapproval of Galileo for publishing something that he had promised the Pope he would not publish until stellar parallax could validate it. So in other words, the heliocentric solar system, the sun at the center of the solar system, was at that time still a hypothesis. It was not a confirmed theory. And so the Pope said, don't publish this as fact because it's going to lead to, a great deal of consternation between the Protestants and the Catholics, the Protestants taking a harder line on the biblical writ. And so he said, you're going to really put me in between a rock and a hard place. Just wait until we can get stellar parallax to validate this. And Galileo didn't wait. He basically, boomed ahead, published it as a fact before he had any evidence. That would have to come about almost 200 years later, and with Bessel and so forth. And the key thing there is that he kind of broke a promise. He not only didn't have the facts in hand, he broke a promise to the Pope, and that, of course, exacerbated the problem. And the rest, as they say, is truly history. That was seized upon in the 18th century to make it look like an opposition between the church and science, and that was never the case. The church was always perhaps the greatest, if not a super great promoter of the natural sciences, even from the days of the medieval university, including the development of the scientific method itself. And as I said, the Jesuits at the Roman College were collaborators of Galileo until, of course, he broke that promise and basically called the Pope a simpleton, by identifying
Which is never
the Pope
a good
with
place
that
to start.
Never a good place to start.
Matthew, so
Exactly.
then Father Spitzer, I think, is making an interesting conclusion. He's bringing us to the point of making sure that we don't think we actually have to make a choice. How do science and religion then, since we're not making a choice, how do they inform each other?
Well, Pope St. John Paul II expressed it beautifully when he said that one of the roles that religion can play, and this is especially true in the modern world, is helping to purify science from what he referred to as idolatry and also false absolutes. We're living in an era in which scientism is increasingly rampant, and science itself is being overrun by ideology at the expense, I think, of objective reality and also, of course, of the pure scientific method. So the Church, as John Paul stressed, as Pope Benedict XVI has stressed, there are obvious touch points between the two. And the two must coexist, and the two can actually inform each other. And as Father said, in the history of the Church, in the history of civilization, that the Church has provided through such heroic figures as Father George Lemaitre, so much of the scientific method, the building of civilization, everything that we see around us, we can owe in so many different ways to great figures in the history of the Church.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us today. And remember, there's lots more to see from EWTN News in Depth, plus more from Father Spitzer and Matthew Bunson on the topic of UFOs and whether space aliens have souls. For that conversation, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We'll be right back with this week's news headlines.
I promise you, we know. What you're doing here is incredible, having to deal with the uncertainty.
Heartbreak in South Florida. The president consoles those whose loved ones are missing in the condo collapse as the reality of loss sets in. And commemorating 70 years, Pope Francis expresses appreciation for Pope Emeritus Benedict on the anniversary of his ordination. The Week in Review is next. A sign that America's presence is winding down in Afghanistan tops This Week in Review. Overnight on Friday, the U.S. announced America had withdrawn from Bagram Airfield near Kabul after almost 20 years of what's been called the never-ending war. Who controls Bagram Airfield has long been symbolic of who controls the country. Overnight, the airfield was handed over to the Afghan National Security and Defense Forces. Critics have warned the troop withdrawal could devolve Afghanistan into a civil war, as the Taliban have made battlefield gains. Afghans are lining up by the thousands to get new passports to possibly leave the country. Several hundred U.S. troops will remain in the country to secure the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. President Joe Biden is promising sustained help, with $40 billion annually to finance Afghani national security forces through 2024. The man widely associated with the war in Afghanistan has died. Former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld passed away Tuesday at the age of 88. He was both the youngest and oldest defense secretary, serving President Ford at the age of 43 and again for President George W. Bush at the age of 74. Rumsfeld was in the Pentagon on 9/11 when terrorists crashed a jet into the building. He famously helped evacuate victims. Rumsfeld was widely seen as the architect of the Iraq War and resigned in 2006 amid growing controversy over both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. The tragedy of the Florida condo collapse grows as hope dims that survivors will be found. The disaster got in-person federal attention on Thursday with a presidential visit. President Biden and the First Lady spent 3 hours in private discussions with the families before paying their respects at a memorial wall covered in flowers and photos of the missing. Mr. Biden was briefed on the situation with the Florida governor and Miami-Dade County mayor, citing the importance of unified government and community response. He described his emphasis on consoling the families.
Jill and I wanted them to know that we're with them and the country's with them. Our message today is that we're here for you as one nation, as one nation. And that's the message we communicated.
The president also met with first responders to express the country's gratitude for risking their lives and trying to find survivors in the rubble. He says the federal government will pick up 100% of the first month of the search and rescue costs. And the State Department is expediting visas for the many condo family members from other countries. The U.S. Justice Department has imposed a moratorium on all federal executions. On Thursday, Attorney General Merrick Garland announced a reversal of last year's decision by the Trump administration to resume executions of federal death row inmates. Since last summer, 13 federal inmates have been executed. Garland says the department will conduct a review of its own policies related to the change made last year. President Biden approved the decision, and the White House says Mr. Biden is working towards abolishing federal executions and hopes to incentivize states to follow suit. Pope Francis held a private audience with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken this week. The State Department says the Pope and Secretary Blinken discussed China and the humanitarian crises in Lebanon, Syria, Ethiopia, and Venezuela during their 40-minute meeting. Officials say the U.S. government is seeking to work with the Holy See to promote human rights and address climate change issues. 2 women were seriously injured after an explosion inside a Catholic church in the Democratic Republic of Congo. A homemade bomb went off early Sunday morning before the start of a children's confirmation ceremony. The explosion at the church was one of 3 that happened in the city of Beni last weekend. The region has experienced attacks from the Allied Democratic Forces and ISIS. In April, Catholic bishops appealed for an end to the bloodshed amid ongoing violence. Next week, EWTN News In Depth will be dedicating an entire hour-long program to the church in Africa. We will look at the challenges and opportunities the church faces there, this time next week. A new poll on abortion indicates that a majority of Americans believe abortions should be illegal in the 2nd and 3rd trimesters. However, they're also supportive of abortions in the 1st trimester of pregnancy. The poll by the Associated Press and the National Opinion Research Center finds that 61% of Americans say that abortion should be legal in nearly all circumstances in the 1st trimester. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, most of the abortions performed in 2018 were in the 1st trimester. However, there is a big shift in opinion the longer the pregnancy. 65% of Americans say abortion should be illegal in the 2nd trimester, and 80% say it should be illegal in the 3rd trimester. Republicans and evangelical Christians are more likely to oppose legal abortion than other religious and non-religious people in most or all cases during each trimester. And special words of praise for Pope Emeritus Benedict from Pope Francis on the 70th anniversary of his ordination. In an emotional Angelus address earlier this week, Pope Francis gave thanks for what he calls Benedict's contemplative gaze, constantly directed toward the horizon of God. Joseph Ratzinger was ordained a priest in the Archdiocese of Munich, Germany in June 1951. The 94-year-old offered Mass privately to mark the occasion. His personal secretary told EWTN that for Pope Benedict, to be a priest has been the most important thing of his life.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
On this patriotic weekend, a look back at how Congress, the Knights of Columbus, and Dwight Eisenhower came together to get a reference to God into the Pledge of Allegiance. We'll be right back. Most of us said the Pledge of Allegiance every day we attended school. It's something we've all memorized. But for those of us who learned it after 1954, there was an important addition, the phrase, "under God." On this July 4th weekend, reporter Mark Irons gives us a patriotic lesson on how the pledge found God.
I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America
and to the republic for which it stands,
one nation, under God,
indivisible, with liberty
and justice for all.
These words initially included no reference to God. In 1893, the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag read, "One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." 61 years later, in 1954, it was updated, "One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." The force behind the change, a Catholic fraternal organization, the Knights of Columbus.
The Knights of Columbus Board of Directors passed a resolution asking that the United States adopt under God into the Pledge of Allegiance.
Supreme Knight Patrick Kelly said the organization had informally been adding under God in the pledge at Knights of Columbus meetings. The idea made its way to Washington.
And we sent that resolution to policymakers, to the House and to the Senate, and to the Eisenhower administration.
Sure enough, after favorable responses from members of Congress, lawmakers agreed to amend the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, "One Nation under God." On Flag Day in 1954, it was made official with a signature from President Dwight D. Eisenhower.
The commander-in-chief thanked the Knights of Columbus. In a message to then Supreme Knight Luke E. Hart, President Eisenhower said of the two-word addition, "These words will remind Americans that despite our great physical strength, we must remain humble. They will help us to keep constantly in our minds and hearts the spiritual and moral principles which alone give dignity to man, and upon which our way of life is founded."
Our rights, our human rights come from the Lord, right? It comes from God, and the state can't take these rights away.
Kelly says he's proud to lead an organization that pushes for religious liberty, and the work continues.
We operate and we work for religious freedom domestically, but we also do that internationally.
In the nation's capital, Mark Irons.
One nation under God.
Under God.
EWTN News in Depth.
Thank you, Mark. Something you'll probably think about the next time you recite the pledge. And from our viewers, this week's Image of the Week. Christine Coure from Brampton, Canada shows us this beautiful Marian statue in her backyard. Our Lady has a special place in Christine's outdoor grotto, but Canada winters are cold. And Christine tells us that's when she brings the Mother Mary statue inside. We'd like to share more pictures showing how you are experiencing Catholic life in your home or parish. Email us your video or photos to indepth@EWTN.com so we can feature them in our Images of the Week. That's it for this edition of EWTN News in Depth. I'm Montse Alvarado. Join us again next week for more discussions and stories impacting your Catholic life. We hope to see you then.